Welcome back to Restored Gospel Podcast, where we're friends having casual conversation about the things of eternity. And we welcome you into that conversation. May or may not be recording on the same day as the last episode. We may or may not have on different clothes to try to trick you, although now you're in the know. Oh boy. All right. This is the episode we have been looking forward to. And I know all three of us have. We're going to talk about the actual text of the Book of Mormon, the miracle that it is, the way beyond any thought of 1830 rural America. So I'm just going to turn it over to Shane, and we're going to dive into why the text is a proof that the Book of Mormon is divine.
Thanks, Mike. So I've been excited about this one. This is the to me, this is kind of the aha moment. If you're looking to prove anything, this is pretty hard to deny. Mainly because the Book of Mormon has, we have access to part of the original documents that were actually written down, by Oliver Cowdery and others on, the original manuscript. And then we also have the entire printer's manuscript, which was copied off of the original manuscript to take to the printer. And so those are, we've got some original documents, even though the Book of Mormon over time, there have been some changes and things that have been, had to be changed back to the original as much as we could. But there's just some amazing stuff in here in terms of the Hebrew. And so I want to share this. And this is a lot of this stuff that wasn't known about in the 1830s when the book came out. So
As you're pulling this up, just reminding our audio listeners, should have done this last time. I imagine this is going to be very valuable on video, even to see the way things are laid out. So if you haven't ever, just check out YouTube and look up Restore Gospel Podcast. You can watch all of the podcasts on video as well as audio. So, all right, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So, okay. So we're going to start with talking about the original studies of the Hebrew language. People don't realize that Hebrew was almost a dead language. It almost died completely. And so it was only really known in scholarly circles. So I'll start off here with Edward Lee. He wrote a book called the Hebrew Roots Dictionary in 1712. It was available for biblical vocabulary. So people could look up certain words if they wanted to understand the Hebrew meaning behind certain words, they could look them up. Then Johann Albrecht Bengel first used the term in 1742, and the term I'm talking about is chiasm, and so they kind of discovered these parallelisms and these things about Hebrew that began to appear even in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, but it was written by Hebrew thinkers. And then you've got there's other Hebrew poetry that was discovered. The parallelisms were broken down into smaller parts: synonymous, antithetic, and synthetic. These were identified by Robert Loth in 1753. And so you can see that over time, these scholars, as they dug more in, they started realizing they had these trends about the ancient Hebrew language that no one knew about before. Thomas Boyes and John Jebb were Anglican scholars in the 1800s. They identified multiple chiastic structures in the Bible. So you had these scholars identifying Hebrew and chiasms and all that, and then all of a sudden they started looking at the Bible and saying, "Hey, there's stuff in here. There's chiasms in here." And then Michael Dahoud was also a biblical scholar. He said this. He said, "On micro and macro levels, chiasmus has been shown to be a basic element in the formal structure of biblical literature." And that was in 1976. And then, so most scholars in 1829, so the scholars that would have been around when Joesph Smith received the book, they used this book called the Hebrew Grammar. It was written in 1813, and it was starting to become kind of a standard reference to understand the original Hebrew words of the Bible. Biblical scholars would studied the square Aramaic form of Hebrew that was used in printed Bibles. So Paleo Hebrew, which was the older Hebrew, the pre-Babylonian captivity Hebrew, was basically unknown. And they just kind of speculated about it in 1829. They really didn't know anything about it at all. And so remember, Aramaic was actually the language Jesus spoke. Aramaic Hebrew was the form of Hebrew they were using in Christ's day. The Paleo Hebrew, the older form of Hebrew, was virtually unused, other than in the temples with scholars. But as far as out on the commoners out on the streets, they spoke Aramaic. And so Hebrew actually nearly died out as a spoken language after the Babylonian conquest. It got replaced by the Aramaic. And a lot of people, they don't realize that that it almost was gone completely. Hebrew was treated as a static and exclusive, was basically exclusively a scholarly language to use to study the Torah. It was not something you would use just in conversation. But the late 1800s, there began to be a revival among Jews, and the study of the Hebrew language was led by this guy named Eliezer ben Yehuda. And the Hebrew language is the only language today to be successfully revived. So in other words, it was a language that people had basically stopped speaking. And then all of a sudden, because of this big push by these scholars and by these Jews, they were able to revive it to where it became Hebrew is now a very common spoken language by millions of people. But it almost completely died out totally. By 1922, Hebrew became the official language of British Palestine. And then today, 9 million people speak Hebrew. And this guy, John W. Welch, he was the first, he was an LDS guy. And he was the first one to discover the chiasms in the Book of Mormon. So you had all these scholars, biblical scholars, are discovering all this ancient Hebrew and, understanding poetic structures and parallelisms and chiasms. They're getting all excited because of the Bible. And so this guy says, well, I wonder if the Book of Mormon should have some of that if it's a Hebrew, has a Hebrew foundation. And sure enough, he found a lot. And so he published a paper entitled Chiasmus in the Book of Mormon in 1969. So we really didn't know anything about the Hebrew language stuff until this guy in 1969 when he published this book. So that means from 1830 to 1969, no one even knew that there was really any Hebrew stuff in the Book of Mormon. And that's the thing. If Joesph had written the book, or if he had conspired with a bunch of other Hebrew scholars or something to put together this book, why wouldn't that have been brought out? Why wouldn't they have said, hey, look here, imagine that, there's all this Hebrew structure, but it didn't. No one knew anything about it until 1969. And so translating languages in general is difficult, but Hebrew is especially difficult. And so I just want to show you kind of a quick example to help you understand why it's such a challenge. So this is actually Genesis 6:16 written in modern Hebrew. And so if you take those words and you literally translate each word for word the way that it is written, this is how it would read. A light you do to an ark, and to a cubit you complete it from to over it, and a door of the ark in its side you put unders 20 and 30 you do. Now that's the literal translation of what those words all say. And obviously it's not intelligible, right? So translators, they have to look at that and say, okay, well, here's what he's trying to say. And so it gets translated. King James Version says, a window thou shalt make to the ark, and a cubit shalt thou finish it above, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. And then you've got these more modern, the modern guys say, well, no, wait a minute, that's too clunky still. Let's make it more modern. Let's say this. Let's say make a roof for it and finish the ark with 18 inches of the top, put a door in the side of the ark, and make lower, middle, and upper decks. And so you kind of see the process of how we think. You can't take the literal text that's in Hebrew and just straight translate it and have anything that makes any sense. There is human interpretation involved in that process. Some interpreter, in some monastery has to sit there and think, okay, now what is it trying to say here? And it puts it into the modern English of their time. And that's what's so amazing about the Book of Mormon, is that is not what happened. There was no expert sitting there saying, okay, this is Paleo Hebrew for this word, I'm going to translate it this way. This was simply God giving him the words and him writing them down. And that really makes the Book of Mormon unique in terms of books, because even the Bible, which we're showing here in this example, had to go through the hands of humans and be put in a intelligible way that we all understand. And that means it's prone to errors. I mean, there just are, because human hands have been involved in it.
This so let me move. Place to interject, Shane, just to, maybe some people don't know this, but in the Book of Mormon text, clear back in Ether, which is found as the last book, but also one of the, and as far as chronological, it would be in the earliest part of the records, we hear about these interpreters that were made by God to be used to translate records. And in spite of what the LDS Church has done in latter years to kind of walk away from Joesph Smith using the interpreters to looking into a hat and a stone and all kinds of other things, we believe, and there's much evidence to show, we've done an episode on this with Jonathan Neville, that Joesph put on these interpreters that were made for this process. And by the gift and power of God, each word was given to him. And that was the process of translation. It wasn't him trying to understand Hebrew or write the best word. It wasn't even him looking into a hat with a stone. It was these interpreters that were given with the plates. And so as he would look and see the word God by the power of God, as it says in the title page of the Book of Mormon, that was how it would be translated. So I just to bring everybody on the same page there, if they didn't know or are hearing this for the first time. And that's why we say, the error of man was taken out of the equation.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Mike. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the way the Hebrews think. So, we all have these cultural characteristics in the way that our minds work. And, we can't read the Book of Mormon or the Bible and think like an American in 2025. We've got to be able to understand where they're coming from, what was going on in their day, and how they thought. And so understanding the Hebrew mind is really critical. So if I was to ask you, Mark, I'll pick on you. If I was to ask you to describe what you see on the screen, how would you describe that?
Well, I guess it's two blades with a handle on each one, fastened at a fulcrum point with a screw that allows you to rub the sharp edges of the blades together in a systematic way.
Okay. How about you, Mike? What would you say?
Scissors.
silver picture, black circle. two silver blades hooked together with thumb holes and finger holes to work the object.
Yeah, we describe it by how it appears, right? The colors, the black, the shiny blades, the sharpness, But a Hebrew would describe this as a tool that can be used for cutting, that has sharp blades. They would describe it in what it does and not how it looks. They wouldn't talk about the colors. They wouldn't talk about the black handles. It would be more about its action. And that's just the difference between a Hebrew mind or an ancient Eastern mind versus our modern Western mind. And so I have a little video. Oftentimes Corey will quote from a guy named Jeff Benner. He's a non-LDS. He's a biblical scholar who has done a lot of research in Hebrew and studying ancient Hebrew. And his findings are just fascinating. And I kind of went over his website and found a lot of things. But he made this little video that explains what the difference in the way we think is, and the idea of what concrete thought versus abstract thought. And I can explain it to you, but I like the video, so I'm going to let him do it. So here we go.
Words paint pictures in your mind. Let's take this passage as an example. Psalms 1 verse 3. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. In your mind, can you see the imagery of the passage, the tree, the river, the fruit? However, some words do not paint a picture as easily. Let's take this passage, for example, Psalms 103, verse 8. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and plenteous in mercy. Words like merciful, gracious, anger, and mercy do not convey any imagery for the mind to see. These two different styles of thought are called concrete and abstract. A sentence like, a tree planted by the rivers of water, is an example of concrete thought. And merciful and gracious is an example of abstract thought. While our modern Western languages commonly make use of these abstract words and thoughts, the ancient Hebrews did not. Their language exclusively used concrete words. But you might be asking, if the Hebrews did not make use of abstracts, then why does Psalms 103 verse 8 contain such abstract words? The original Hebrew was written with concrete words, but when the translators translated into English, these concrete Hebrew words were translated into abstract English words. Now, this does not mean that the Hebrews were incapable of abstract thought. On the contrary, there is a lot of abstract thinking within the text, but these abstract ideas are rooted in something concrete. To demonstrate this, let's look at the words in Psalm 103, verse 8. The Hebrew word translated as merciful is rahum, and concretely means wrapped in the arms for protection. Gracious is the translation of the word chanun, which means provide needs and comfort. The Hebrew word aphim, translated as anger, is the plural form of the word aph, meaning nose. Aphim means nostrils, but in this context it means the flaring of the nostrils when angry. Chesed, translated as mercy, literally means to bow the head in kindness. If we take the Hebrew of Psalms 103 verse 8 and translate it according to the concrete background of these words, it would read, the Lord wraps his arms around you for protection and provides your needs and comfort, prevents his nostrils from flaring, and bows his head towards you, presenting you with plenteous acts of kindness.
So,
Very cool.
yeah, I love it. So here's the words. Here's what they mean. And so when we see the words merciful, gracious, mercy, things like that in the Book of Mormon, if we apply what he said there, then we can get a little deeper understanding. So here's a scripture. It says, this is out of 1 Nephi. It says, and if it so be that the children of men keep the commandments of God, he doth nourish them and strengthen. And that means El Shaddai. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And provide ways and means, or the grace, whereby they can accomplish the things which he had commanded them. Wherefore he did provide ways and means, or give grace, for us while we did sojourn in the wilderness. And so he's using these concrete words like nourishing and strengthening and providing a means and all that to mean these spiritual words, these abstract ideas of merciful and gracious and and mercy. Here's another one. Thus God hath provided a means, or given grace, that man through faith might work mighty miracles. Therefore he becometh a great benefit to his fellow beings. So here's another example. We're wrapped in the arms of mercy. And thus mercy can satisfy the demands of justice and encircles them in the arms of safety. While he that exerciseth no faith unto repentance is exposed to the whole law of the demands of justice. Therefore only unto him that hath faith unto repentance is brought about the great and eternal plan of redemption. And so here you see he's actually using the phrase encircles them in the arms of safety, which means merciful. So he's giving them mercy, but the Book of Mormon actually says the phrase from what this original Hebrew word means, and that is encircling them in the arms of safety. Here's another one. But behold, the Lord hath redeemed my soul from hell. I have beheld his glory, and I am encircled about eternally in the arms of his love. And see, the arms is concrete language. So you're encircled internally in the arms of his love, which is the mercy of God, God's mercy. Isn't that cool?
Absolutely. That's one that I think we've mentioned several times, and this just blows my mind how Joesph is hitting these definitions of Hebrew. I should say, and that's a misnomer, right? That's what people would say. God, it's because it's actually God and his prophets and translating correctly. But if you were making them up, he would have to have used this Hebrew knowledge of what these words are that's missing from the Bible by and large, where it gives these because of its translation, as you pointed out, Shane.
Yeah.
And get it right every time when there was no knowledge at the time. This all came years later.
Yeah. I mean, this is proof that Joesph Smith did not write this,
Right.
because no one knew about this. So the idea of concrete and abstract thought is all through the Book of Mormon. It is just really, it's awash with it. And I'll just show you some examples. It says out of First Nephi, and when my father saw the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea, he spake unto Laman, saying, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this river." So see, he's not saying, "Oh, that you would be righteous." He's saying that you'll be like this river. And so it's concrete. It's something you can look at, you can see, you can taste, you can feel, you can wash in it. Oh, that thou mayest be like this river, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness. So you see these words like fountain and river, these are things, but they represent something spiritual. Then he says, and he also spake unto Lemuel, saying, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this valley, firm and steadfast and immovable, in keeping the commandments of the Lord." And here's another one. "For the fire of the anger of the Lord shall be kindled against them, and they shall be as stubble." And so here he's painting these word images. You see this fire, you see stubble. The day shall come that shall consume them. You get this visual image of this thing being burned down to the nubs. And that is an example of concrete language. Here's another one. "But behold, that great and abominable church, the whore," he calls it the whore of all the earth, "must tumble to the earth, and great must be the fall thereof. For the kingdom of the devil must shake, and they which belong to it must needs be stirred up unto repentance, or the devil will grasp them with his everlasting chains." Now, again, he doesn't have chains, right? I mean, it's spiritual, but he uses these concrete words to describe a spiritual detail or event. And so I'm not going to read all these, but you can see all these names of Jesus, titles of Jesus and of God. They are concrete language that describes some characteristic of who God is. So he's the Son of Man. He's the I Am. He's the bread of life. He's the light of the world. These are all concrete words describing this spiritual aspect of who God is. The good shepherd, the door, the way, the truth, the life, the resurrection and the life, the true vine, the Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ, the bridegroom, the Alpha and Omega, the living water, the rock, the teacher, the prophet, the servant, the King of kings, Lord of lords, the Lamb of God, the Lord omnipotent, the Holy One of Israel. And so you get all these things. These are all our concrete language injected in to help us have a better picture of who he is, rather than just saying God in a generic way. So here's some examples in the Book of Mormon. It says, "In the gospel of Jesus Christ, shall be declared among them. Wherefore they shall be restored unto the knowledge of their fathers, and also to the knowledge of Jesus Christ, which was had among their fathers. And then they shall rejoice, for they shall know that it is a blessing unto them from the hand of God. And their scales of darkness shall begin to fall from their eyes, and many generations shall not pass away among them, save they shall be a white and a delightsome people. So there's a lot of things here to look at. So scales of darkness, he's talking about this blindness of the mind of because of sin, fall from their eyes. I mean, nothing's going to physically happen to our eyes, right? It's all spiritual. But again, it's concrete language describing it. And here's another one, white. So this often is interpreted as, like racism, like, oh, the only the white people are righteous, right? Or, he's going to turn them into white people if they repent. And that's not what it's saying. It's using the concrete word white to describe a spiritual condition of purity. One thing interesting about this is in the 1840 edition, which was edited by Joesph Smith, he changed this word white to pure. And I wanted to show you, this is out of the actual printer's manuscript. You notice that it says white there. So the word was originally white, and Joesph changed it to pure. And while it does mean pure, he took away a Hebrew concrete word of white and made it into an abstract, modern word of pure.
He did what the biblical translators were doing, but after God gave him the correct word, he then was, well, let's make this better for our day and time, and maybe get away this connotation of whiteness or whatever, right? So he then stepped in, and that's how we interject man into something when he shouldn't,
right?
Or we should say where there's a better Hebrew purpose that we're seeing now that shows the legitimacy of the text.
Right. Yeah. I mean, from a logical human standpoint, it should read pure. That's what it means, right? That's the definition. Mm-hmm. But by doing that, he took away a Hebrew proof, by taking out the concrete word.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if the purpose of the Book of Mormon is to convince the Jew and the Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, when they begin to maybe accept this text, you would want these things in there, I think, just to add to the foundation that this is of God and this is Hebrew in nature.
Right. Well, and he didn't understand about concrete and abstract at that time. But my thinking is just leave it alone. I mean, don't assume that you know better. So it's consistent with the Bible. Daniel 12:10 says, "Many shall be purified and made white and tried." Now, it's not talking about making them into white people, right? It's talking about purification. They're made whole, they're made clean, they're made white. So we see that in the Bible as well. So this is an interesting one. The original manuscript, this is a picture of it, and the printer's manuscript, which I think I have a picture popping up here in a second, but both of them say what's on the left here. "Hearken and hear this, O house of Jacob, which are called by the name of Israel, and are come forth out of the waters of Judah, which swear by the name of the Lord, and make mention of the God of Israel, yet they swear not in truth nor in righteousness." So this phrase, "out of the waters of Judah," is a Hebrew phrase that means of their lineage, or that was born of the family of Judah. The water, when you're born of your mother's water, right? The water breaks and the baby comes out. It's a way they would say this, coming out of the mother of the tribe of Judah. So look what it was changed to. This is again Joesph changing this in 1840. He added this phrase, "or out of the waters of baptism." So he understood this to mean baptism. So he added that to try to add clarification, but that's not what it said. And here's the printer's manuscript that shows you what it originally said right here: "Waters of Judah." It doesn't have anything about baptism there. So that was added 10 years later to try to make it fit what his understanding of was about baptism. but he took away, this is a Hebrew, a legitimate Hebrew way of saying being birthed from this lineage of Judah, and it has nothing to do with baptism.
And that just highlights that Joseph translated this by the gift and power of God, because 10 years into this work, he still didn't really get it. I mean,
Right.
just such strong evidences.
I think it also highlights in things we've talked about that when people hold up Joseph as an idol and this prophet, does a prophet not know the word of God? Or does I mean, this is the work of man, not the work of a prophet. I'm not saying he never had the gift of prophecy, as many people in the early church did at times. It's a gift of the Spirit, but it goes to show you, you know, it'd be like Isaiah going back and changing something and making it, you know, not fit what God was saying in the first place. And we you know, and then it would make you wonder, well, how prophetic is that if you're completely off base on what the text even means? It's not talking about baptism at all. I mean, we may say, well, he's a prophet. Well, how unprophetic is that? Right. So you have to look at both sides of the coin. I'm not saying anything about Joseph's heart, but I'm saying we're talking about the gift of prophecy and a prophet giving the words of God. But he misunderstood this complete text here.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people who think, well, you know, God used him to bring forth the book, and therefore he has a right to change it if he wants to later. You know, if, you know, he had further revelation, maybe he realized they hadn't written something down right. Or, I mean, there's all kinds of excuses you could make for him. But the fact is that he changed the meaning of this verse, and the original meaning was beautiful. It didn't need to be changed, you know, if you understood the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, let's go to the next thing. So this is really interesting. So the word, we've all probably heard El Shaddai, right? You know, that song, you know, from the 80s Christian rock, you know, El Shaddai, El Shaddai. So El Shaddai, this is how it's broken down. So Hebrew reads right to left. So this is the Hebrew for El. It means mighty or strong. And here is the Hebrew for teat or breast, which is kind of funny. It sounds funny to say that, but El Shaddai literally means the mighty breast. And so you're like, what in the world does that mean? Well, again, we have concrete language, right? And so God, the breast of a mother was associated with salvation. You know, that baby could not survive without the mother's milk. And so the breast of the mother and the milk and that whole process was associated with God and how he sustains us and how he supports us and provides us, and we can't survive without him. So it's actually El Shaddai is a term of endearment. So here you have this. Look what happens with Nephi. It says, and so great were the blessings of the Lord upon us, that while we did live upon raw meat in the wilderness, our women did give plenty of suck for their children and were strong, yea, even like unto the men. And they began to bear their journeyings without murmuring. And thus we see that the commandments of God must be fulfilled. And if it so be that the children of men keep the commandments of God, he doth nourish them and strengthen them, and provide ways and means whereby they can accomplish the thing which he hath commanded them. Wherefore he did provide ways and means for us while we did sojourn in the wilderness. Now, if you read if you read Nephi's writings at all, you find that he's got so many Hebrewisms and chiasms and stuff all through it. It's incredible, but he does a lot of play on words too. And I think what he's doing here is he's comparing what God did for them in the wilderness. He nourished and strengthened them in the wilderness, just like the women were able to provide plenty of suck for their children and were strong. And El Shaddai means the mighty breast.
It's hard to understand in our culture today. Having spent 9 years working with newborns in the home and babies and families, and learn more about breastfeeding than I ever thought I wanted to know. people nowadays, if the woman's breast milk's not working correctly, or they can't produce it, or the baby has deficiencies, they can buy formula at Walmart and make nourishment, right? But back then, this was a matter of life and death. Like every few hours, if that woman's not producing enough milk, enough calories, that baby's going to die. And the only option they would have had would be to use another mother that is providing milk, perhaps for her child. But you couldn't just substitute, something else like we are so used to today. So it was imperative that those mothers had not just milk, but enough milk. And it says they became strong, right, in the wilderness. And I love how you pointed out that he then uses those concrete language to show and compare with what God did to them in the wilderness, that they absolutely had to depend on him or they were going to die, right? For their strength, for their food, just like that, the giant mighty breast, right?
Right. Well, and also just to give a little more background for those that maybe aren't familiar with the story, they were on an 8-year journey. They were traveling across Saudi Arabia down the coast of the Red Sea. And this was a route that was used by traders. The frankincense route was right along that route. And so there was a lot of crime. It was scary. It was a scary place to be. I mean, we hear them say they're going off in the wilderness, and we just assume it's like this empty desert, right? But it actually was a very populated area. The city of Mecca is actually right along that route. And so he commanded them that they eat raw meat, that they don't make any fires. So for 8 years, they're in that wilderness, making that journey along the desert there with no fires, because fires would tip people off to where they are, right? And so they're eating all their meat raw, and God told them to do that, and he would make it sweet for them. And so they made their meat sweet. And so it says right here, while we did live on raw meat in the wilderness, our women did give plenty of suck. So even though they were probably fairly malnourished and exhausted and kind of hiding for their lives for 8 years, and while they're giving birth to children and everything else, God still provided what they needed to survive. And this is Nephi identifying that, and then also identifying that God also was the great El Shaddai that provided for them as well, spiritually speaking. So, all right. So the next thing that we come to is this phrase, "and it came to pass," and that has been a common item of ridicule to the Book of Mormon. I think it was Mark Twain that said something about if you took all the "and it came to passes" out of it, it'd just be a short brochure, and I mean, it's been a lot of ridicule has been because of that. And it's really interesting because "and it came to pass" was actually a really common Hebrew marker that's used for transition between events. So it was a common way to transition to the next thing. It actually appears over 1,400 times in the Book of Mormon, and it appears 1,200 times in the Hebrew Bible, but it only appears 727 times in the KJV, because when they translated, they took a lot of those out. They thought it seemed too much, so they took them out. But that is really actually good Hebrew, and the original Hebrew Bible itself has nearly as much as the Book of Mormon of those. But it's also not found in sections that are like poetic or prophetic or a sermon, like King Benjamin's speech. You don't find it in there. It's only where they're telling a story, like, we went across the desert. We went and got the plates, from Laban, that kind of a thing. That's where you hear those "and it came to passes," because it's part of those Hebrew markers that they use to make transitions between scenes of an event. Dr. Ebed Seraphim, who was a native Egyptian expert in Semitic languages, said that the phrase is more of an evidence for the Book of Mormon. Now, he wasn't a Mormon, but he said it's more of an evidence for the Book of Mormon being ancient due to its alignment with ancient Semitic usage. So the usage of "and it came to pass" is right on the mark on how ancient Hebrews would have spoken. Donald W. Perry, who's also a biblical Hebrew scholar, said the Book of Mormon's use of "and it came to pass" is consistent with Hebrew narrative conventions and not randomly inserted.
That's the key right there, as I was seeing that. Again, if man is creating this book as a big fraud, you have to know the correct context to use, and it came to pass. And you'd have to be up on all of that and never screw up throughout the whole, body of work. That's what it says, not randomly. And that's a huge key. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
the same thing, Mike. That's really powerful.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so there's something else interesting about Hebrew. So Hebrew is uses masculine and feminine. So if you've studied Spanish at all, you've got el and la, two different forms. The nouns have femininity or masculinity. And so some examples of I lost my mouse here. Some examples of masculine words are like heaven, justice, man, father, Elohim. And then feminine examples are earth, mercy, woman, mother, and Adonai. So both of these, like for example, Elohim and Adonai, are both names of God, right? But one is a masculine form and one is a feminine form. And so you find this in the Book of Mormon. So right here, this is a wonderful example in Alma. It says, and thus they are restored into his presence to be judged according to their works, according to the law and justice. For behold, justice, which is over here, exerciseth his demands, and also mercy, which is on the feminine side, claimeth with all which is her own, and thus none but the truly penitent are saved. Now, how would anyone in 1830, especially Joesph Smith, know that justice was a his and mercy was a her? All right, so let's move on to adjectives. So the Book of Mormon does not have a lot of descriptive words in comparison to like modern English. And so the most common adjective that's used is this word exceeding. And so a lot of times, like you'll say, I was exceeding sore and my wrists were exceeding sore and my heart was exceeding broken because of my brother's exceeding evil or whatever, you know what I mean? And so it uses succeeding a lot, but it doesn't give a lot of it isn't like if you were to describe your ankle, you would probably say, oh, it was swollen, it was black, and and it was, I could barely move. And I mean, you use all these descriptions, whereas you see this exceeding all the time as really the only description. So I'll give you some examples. And this is consistent with ancient Hebrew. And it came to pass that as he prayed unto the Lord, there came a pillar of fire and dwelt upon a rock before him. And he saw and heard much. And because of the things which he saw and heard, he did quake and tremble exceedingly. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, being exceeding young, nevertheless being large in stature, and it came to pass that when my father had heard these words, he was exceeding glad. And we began to be exceeding sorrowful, and my brethren were about to return unto my father in the wilderness. And it came to pass that when Laban saw our property, that it was exceeding great, he did lust after it. And I beheld his sword, and I drew it forth from the sheath thereof, and the hilt thereof was of pure gold, and the workmanship thereof was exceeding fine. And so you see this exceeding all through it. And I won't keep reading them all, but I just want to show you. I mean, it just is over and over and over and over. And a lot of people had ridiculed Joesph for not having a lot of descriptive words, but it's totally 100% a Hebrew characteristic. All right. So the next thing we'll talk about is what is a Qasida. And I had never heard of this. It's a weird word, but it's actually it's an ancient form of pre-Islamic, so before Islam, but it's pre-Islamic poetry that was used to express joy or to praise to God. So it actually is outlawed in Islam today. You cannot say a Qasida because over time, oftentimes they would start holding like a beautiful woman up on a pedestal and that kind of thing. And so it became what they considered to be idolatry. And so they outlawed it. But in the Book of Mormon, there is a Qasida that I'll show you. But just to give you the characteristics. So they are inspired by the sight of water gushing from a spring or running down a valley. They are addressed to one or usually two traveling companions. They praise the beauty and the excellence of the scene, calling it to the attention of the hearer as an object lesson. The hearer is urged to be like the thing that he is beholding. These are extemporaneous poems recited with great feeling. So you say it with great emotion. They are very short, each couplet being a complete poem in itself. And one verse must be followed by its brother verse, making a perfect matched pair. And so Lehi, who, remember, he named his children Arabic and Hebrew and Egyptian names. He grew up in an Arabic environment, living, being a merchant, living in Jerusalem in 600 BC. He wrote a Qasida for his sons. And so that's the verse. Here's the Qasida. Oh, that thou might be. Now imagine him saying this emotionally to his two boys, Lam and Lemuel. They're rebellious. They're mad about leaving Jerusalem. They're mad about giving up all their wealth, and they're on their journey. And so as they come to this as they're approaching Shazar, he sees this valley and this river, and he waxes poetic basically and says this Qasida. Another way to say it is an ode. It'd be kind of like an English way of saying it. It's an ode. So he says, oh, that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness. Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this valley, firm and steadfast and immovable in keeping the commandments of God. So, it's just a perfect Qasida. And I mean, obviously, 1830 rural communities did not know about that.
It's interesting though, whenever I read, would be reading the Book of Mormon and come through this, that always stood out as being different or just, what's the word?
Out of place.
Bold. Yeah, out of place, bold, a little over the top. You're reading it and you recognize even in our English that that's like, you picture this guy, from the mountaintops or from the podium, being emotional and a little eccentric and over the top. So even reading that as a young boy, and then you get back into the normal verbiage. I mean, that's, not knowing that was actually a thing, now you can see why it kind of stood out so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, bring me my smoothie shirt. I'm getting off camera here. You guys are rotten.
We're doing week 2 in the same day. And Shane and I changed shirts, and Mark looked like the slob that wears the same shirt every day. Shane, I'm recording this. He doesn't know. It'll be at the end. For real.
Yeah. That's what we need.
He's out changing his shirt. You can hear him. This will be worth the editing.
If you can't trust your RPG guy, whatever that is, who can you trust?